All right, folks. So here we go. I believe this section is the brain stem, medulla oblongata, and pons. Sorry, I just had to get my microphone down. Okay, so let's get going on this section. So the medulla oblongata, you can see that here. That's not the whole thing you see here. Actually, what you see here is the brain stem plus the diencephalon. So there's more than. So remember what the brain stem is. The brain stem is the midbrain and the pons and the medulla oblongata, and you're seeing part of the diencephalon here in the thalamus. So you're seeing more than just the brain stem here. Let me see. What do we got? Got the midbrain here. Midbrain is the cerebral peduncles here, and the superior and inferior colliculi here of the corpora quadrigemina. Those four bodies, the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi, make up the corpora quadrigemina. Here you get the pons, and the pons has ascending and descending fibers as well as transverse fibers running back to the cerebellum. So it's a big relay station, especially between the cerebellum and the cortex. And here you get the medulla oblongata, where there's a bunch of nuclei in there, and we'll talk about some of those nuclei. All right, so that's just an overview of what you see there. Again, this is a ventral view, or anterior view, or a ventral view. You have the olives here and here. I know they're not labeled, but they're the olives. You have the pons, cerebral peduncles. These mammillary bodies are quite often, I mean, we do name them separately from the hypothalamus. Quite often people think they're part of the hypothalamus. They are involved in feeding drives. So we have that, and then of course you got the thalamus. So this is just a ventral view. A lot of this is lab stuff that you're going to learn in lab. A lot of anatomy here. You can see where all the cranial nerves are coming out of the brainstem, and we'll study this. We'll study these cranial nerves and learn about them. So let me see. We're looking at the dorsal view now. So you're looking back at the superior and inferior colliculi, not from the side this time, but the back. You can see there's four bodies called the corpora quadrigemina. This is the pineal gland. These are choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricles. The third ventricle is in here. Uh, so point down through there. So these are choroid plexuses of all that. This is the fourth ventricle right here. This is the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. So more anatomy for you. This is the real brainstem, if you will. Obviously, the diencephalon is not part of the brainstem; it's just showing it there. So this is the real brainstem. All right, now we get started. If you look over here, you have this. You have the olivary nucleus right here. Right here's the olivary nucleus. The olivary nucleus is a relay station from the red nucleus to other parts of the brain and from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. The red nucleus is red because it's very vascular and it has some ferritin and hemoglobin in it, so it's red. So if you say, well, what's if the olivary nucleus is a relay to the red nucleus? What the heck's the red nucleus do? Well, the red nucleus is what we call getting ahead of myself a little bit, but descending tracts have two forms or belong in two classes, and that's the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal. In the pyramidal descending tracts are a lot of voluntary muscle tracts, descending motor fibers that are voluntary and some involuntary, by the way, some posture stuff. But all of the pyramidal tracts, like the cortical spinal tract, which is the main pyramidal tract, they they decussate and then go to these skeletal muscles that you're voluntarily controlling. These extrapyramidal tracts, really ancient track, and it's involved in a lot of subconscious muscle control. So the red nucleus, of course, is involved in a lot of subconscious muscle control. And by the way, the descending tract out of the red nucleus is called the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal. Rubro meaning red. It goes from the red nucleus to the spine, rubrospinal. So olivary nucleus is a relay station for that. The reticular formation, as you can see right here, goes from the pons all the way down to the medulla oblongata. It travels through the whole darn thing, up through the pons and the medulla oblongata. You can see, by the way, just in case you're wondering where you're looking at, look at this box right here. This big picture over here is that box blown up. So you're mainly looking at medullary nuclei here. That's what you're mainly looking at, is medullary nuclei. Now, if you ask me, is part of the pons here? Yeah, you can see we captured some of the pons right here. So this reticular formation is in the pons and the medulla. All right, that's that. What else I want to show you? You can see these reflex centers in the medulla right here. You can see that there's a cardiovascular center right here. And you can see that there's a respiratory center right here. What happens is up in the pons, there's an apneustic and pneumotaxic center, which drops some fibers down to this respiratory rhythmicity center and helps to control it. Helps to control what the medulla sends to your diaphragm and for lack of a better muscle right now. I mean, we'll talk about some other respiratory muscles, but the diaphragm and some other respiratory muscles. So you see the cardiovascular and respiratory centers there. These are ascending nuclei. I mean, when I say ascending nuclei, it means ascending tracts, synapse here, and then these go up to the thalamus and then eventually the cerebral cortex if the thalamus sends them, so they're ascending. You can see some other nuclei for some cranial nerves right here. Remember what nuclei are? They're the soma of neurons, so cranial nerves have some synapse here. The reticular formation, of course, runs through the medulla oblongata all up into the pons, and we'll talk a lot more about the reticular formation. So this is the medulla, and you can see different nuclei in there. Again, when you think medulla, you should think heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. Heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. That's what you should think. This is from a lateral view, and this is showing the pons, by the way. Oh, as we spoke. Here's the apneustic and the pneumotaxic centers right here, purple and purple. The apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. They help to set up the breathing pattern, but they don't do it by themselves. What they do is they send fibers down to the medulla, and the medulla has a respiratory center, and then the respiratory center receives input from apneustic and pneumotaxic centers and helps to set up the whole breathing rhythm. The pons is really just a big relay station, other than two major areas. The respiratory centers, the apneustic and pneumotaxic centers, and the reticular formation that runs through the pons. Other than those two, all the rest is really just relaying from the cerebrum to the cerebellum, because we have transverse fibers going back to the cerebellum. So there's a relay station through the cerebellar peduncles, not the cerebral peduncles. These are cerebral peduncles right here. These are cerebellar peduncles right here. So the pons is a big relay station to the cerebellum. All right, that's about it for the pons. All right, the cerebellum. Now look at these Purkinje fibers right here. These are pretty cool. These Purkinje cells, I should say, because Purkinje fibers are in the heart. Look at these Purkinje cells. Let me just tell you overall what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum overall gives you coordination and motor adjustment, muscle adjustment. It has what we say a comparator function, and I actually show you a comparator diagram at a later point. A comparator function. It compares what you're supposed to be doing. That means the plan from your cerebral cortex to what you actually are doing, and then it makes fine adjustments as you go along. So it's a coordination muscle control lobe, and it has hemispheres. So there's a right and left hemisphere in the cerebellum. Here's the cool thing about these cerebellar cells. There's like 20,000 synapses per cell. That's huge. I mean, that's 10 to 100 times more than the neurons in your cerebral cortex. So the neurons in your cerebral cortex have between 2,000 and 20,000 synapses per cell, whereas the cerebellar cells, like the Purkinje cells, have 20,000 synapses per cell, and that's huge. So definitely big involved in comparator functions, motor control. All right, now we're looking at the midbrain. The midbrain is the cerebral peduncles. That's these guys right here, cerebral peduncles. You can see them here and here. And the corpora quadrigemina, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, those. And then some nuclei deeper than what you see here on the surface, which is the cerebral peduncles and the corpora quadrigemina. The nuclei that are deeper in there are the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. And I'll talk about all of these in a second. But since I have the superior and inferior colliculi right here, let me tell you what they do. The superior colliculi are involved in visual reflexes, processing visual information, and integrate visual information and definitely your visual reflexes, anything that your eyes see and that results in a reflex. The inferior colliculi are involved in auditory reflexes. Now, you probably remember back in the thalamus, I told you that there's a medial and lateral geniculate nucleus. Medial and lateral geniculates. Lateral geniculates. See if I can fit that word in there. Well, here's how I remember it. The eyes are medial to your ears, but the eyes don't go through the medial geniculate. They go through the lateral geniculate. I always remember that they go to the geniculates that are opposite of what they actually are. So the visual input to your brain goes through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the superior colliculus. So the lateral geniculate nucleus sends information to the superior colliculi. The medial geniculate nuclei, now your ears are lateral to your eyes, but the medial geniculate nuclei send information to the inferior colliculi because they take auditory information and send it to the inferior colliculus. So there you go. I will show you can see the red nucleus a little bit there, but there's a better picture where it's a cross section or a transverse section. The red nucleus is red because it's highly vascular with blood vessels. Plus, there's some ferritin, iron-storing protein called ferritin. Plus, there's some hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin has iron in it, as you know. That's why the red nucleus is red. It has a descending rubrospinal tract running out of it, and it's involved in the extrapyramidal motor control. That's a subconscious motor control. Substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is black because melanin, not melatonin, I'm sorry. Melanin. Melanin is a byproduct of dopamine. Let me erase that and spell that correctly for you. Melanin, the pigment melanin, is a byproduct of dopamine biosynthesis. Melanin. So there's a dopamine biosynthetic pathway, and melanin is a byproduct of it. And by the way, the substantia nigra makes a lot of dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter. So because it makes a lot of dopamine, it makes some melanin, and that's why it's black like that. That's involved in motor control as well, subconscious motor control, but indirectly. What happens is the substantia nigra inhibits the basal nuclei, and the basal nuclei itself inhibits unwanted muscle contraction. If there's something wrong in the substantia nigra, then you can't inhibit the basal nuclei, which itself inhibits unwanted muscle contractions. So then you have these unwanted muscle contractions. And Parkinson's disease is one of those diseases where the substantia nigra isn't talking to the basal nuclei well. So then you do not inhibit unwanted muscle contractions. You end up not inhibiting these unwanted muscle contractions. And by the way, the basal nuclei aren't only involved in inhibiting unwanted muscle contractions, they're also involved in just fine motor control and some subconscious motor control as well. All right, the reticular formation. I'm going to show you more about this in a little bit. Probably another chapter, but a little bit. The reticular formation is a decentralized set of nuclei running through the medulla oblongata and the pons. It's involved in your consciousness. Here's really what happens. A whole bunch of input goes into the reticular formation. And so this could be visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, somatosensory, just all of this input goes into the reticular formation. And the reticular formation initiates commands, and it sends signals to the cerebral cortex, and it's involved in maintaining consciousness. Now, as the day progresses, the receptors in the reticular formation become less and less sensitive to this input. So you become less and less likely to remain conscious or stay awake. Now you think of this. You're driving down the road and you're tired, it's late at night, and you turn up the radio and you roll down your window and you got some sensory input. Those sensory input is louder noise and maybe a cold wind. Okay, well that's good sensory input. It might keep you awake for a while. But eventually, those receptors in the reticular formation are going to become insensitive to that, and eventually you will fall asleep. So the reticular formation is set up, it maintains consciousness, and it's also involved in your circadian rhythms in that way. All right, let me think. What's going next? The cerebral peduncles are just tracks, relay tracks. All right, that's about it for the midbrain. Let me show you another picture of the midbrain. Well, that's the same thing with a real brain right there. Oh, here we go. This is the picture I wanted to show you. Here's your cerebral peduncles, here and here. Here's your superior colliculi and your inferior colliculi of your corpora quadrigemina. Here's your cerebral aqueduct running from your third ventricle to your fourth ventricle. Your fourth ventricle is down in here, by the way, right down in there. All right. This is the red nucleus. Now you're going to say, it doesn't look very red to me. Well, yeah, you're right. It's a brain that's been fixed in formalin or whatever. It doesn't look very red right now. Here's the substantia nigra right here. And the substantia nigra is involved in regulating basal nuclei. Basal nuclei. Now remember, basal nuclei inhibit unwanted muscle contractions. So if you lose that regulation between the substantia nigra and the basal nuclei, you'll lose the ability to inhibit unwanted muscle contractions, and you'll get tremors like you see in Parkinson's disease. The substantia nigra, of course, as I said before, has this black pigment melanin because of dopamine synthesis. And by the way, what's the treatment for Parkinson's? L-Dopa, to give you more dopamine. So you can see that we do have a treatment. It doesn't cure the disease. It just treats some of the signs and symptoms, some of the symptoms. All right, so that's the midbrain. You can see we already said all of this. This is just a collage, really. It's just repeating what we already said with the superior and inferior colliculi and stuff like that. All right, so that's the collage for you of the midbrain.